Hello, and welcome once again to HDtv Health District Television, brought to you by the Southern Nevada Health District. I'm Brian Gresh.
Isolation and quarantine, two terms which most of us are fairly familiar with in a general sense, but may not have really considered as far as how they could impact our daily lives. Isolation and quarantine are used in cases of contagious diseases, isolation for those having already contracted an illness, and quarantine for those who may have been exposed but aren't yet displaying any symptoms. They're tools that are used on a small scale quite often in dealing with infectious diseases, but people usually think of isolation and quarantine in the context of a large outbreak when there's an urgent, impending risk to the community's overall public health. Whether the threat is from a naturally occurring disease or a biological attack, such an outbreak would require the intervention of the Chief Health Officer by ordering an isolation and quarantine measure in order to protect the majority of Southern Nevadans. Constitutionally, the Chief Health Officer has that authority, which is supported by law enforcement and the judicial system. Implementing isolation and quarantine measures take place once those infected are notified.
Now, when these things happen, 99% of the time, everybody's in agreement. If you're exposed to a dangerous disease and public health comes to you and provides that information and says, here's the medication we want you to take, here's a vaccine we want to give you, or we want to have you just stay at home and, for a day or two or up to maybe a couple of weeks so you don't come down sick and expose other people, 99% of the time, everybody's in agreement, everybody cooperates. It's a voluntary partnership that works.
Voluntary cooperation is key. But what if just one person is impacted and that someone doesn't want to cooperate? What happens then? Perhaps the person isn't fully able to appreciate the danger, either due to a communication problem or, say, diminished mental capacity. Or perhaps that person has a criminal record and has warrants out for his arrest. Maybe it's a matter of principle. A person feels the government limiting his activities is an infringement of his freedoms. Technically, he'd be correct.
And it clearly is an infringement on individual rights. But the goal of using these powers is not to punish a person, it's simply to provide medical care and to go through a period of time to assure that that period when infection could be transmitted is over.
Dr. Madaw's point is well taken. Forcing a person into mandatory isolation or quarantine would only be done to protect the community as a whole and only in rare circumstances. It's not a step officials take lightly.
In the tension between government restricting your right to move around or to go where you want to go, that balance between individual freedom and the right of government to protect others from being exposed to a disease is a place of tension. So there are legal proceedings that involve due process to protect individual rights and make sure that if the government is going to impose a restriction on your ability to move around or not move around, that you have a right to be represented and to have your individual rights balanced against how good is the case that the government makes to say we need to quarantine or isolate you. And all those procedures and the laws are contained in this bench book.
The bench book is a project the Health District, the judicial system, and law enforcement have been working on for more than a year and a half. Its goal is to organize procedures for having to impose an involuntary isolation or quarantine on someone while making absolutely sure the individual's constitutional and legal rights are not being violated, and ensuring all responding agencies follow the correct procedure. It is vital the process be examined and established before an emergency arose, because when it comes to containing highly contagious diseases, time is of the essence.
And that's why the law provides for an immediate detention, but when that's executed, the clock starts ticking, and within 72 hours, you must have an opportunity to be represented by an attorney and go before a judge and present your case against the case of the public health authorities so that an independent party can make certain that there's adequate evidence to warrant restricting your freedom and behavior. The bench book is a tool, and what it really compiles is all of the statutes, all of the regulations, and then all of the forms that are needed to actually implement quarantine and isolation. And quarantine and isolation are terms that really describe what happens when there's a very serious infectious disease threat. Really, in order to contain the infectious agent, we want to remove people from contacting other people.
The Bench Book project, from the Health District's perspective, encompasses more than just drafting a legal procedures guideline.
In addition to the legal proceedings, and the bench book is focused on the legal proceedings, the laws, the statutes, and the documents needed to actually implement isolation and quarantine, then the other component of the project was to also meet with our medical colleagues and say, if we have somebody with a severely contagious disease and we need to isolate or quarantine them, where will we take it? How will we do it? And how will we really make it real? So that involves, for example, UMC is our go-to hospital because it has negative air pressure rooms, they have security, and we've worked out with them the procedures that if somebody is involuntarily isolated or quarantined, how would we actually deal with that and protect people and make sure that the process is under appropriate legal and judicial review, and that the minimum amount of time or imposition possible is what is used. And that's the whole partnership between law enforcement and public health in this area, is that it's in a way a procedure of last resort. And we can implement voluntary isolation and quarantine, and often do, for many different conditions and diseases. It's only when there's an urgent need to protect the community from a contagious disease and the individuals do not cooperate in a voluntary manner that any of this ever comes into play.
The Bench Book is an evolving process as times and threats change, but rest assured, its goal of protecting individual rights will always remain constant.
So those are the things that we've been exploring for the last year and a half, and we've had our Attorney General of the state, we've had our own attorney at the district, we've worked with Judge Voy, who's in the family court as a judge, who's been very knowledgeable and helpful with this. What it is, it's a major, as we talked about, tension between individual rights and the exercise of governmental police powers that can impinge on those rights, and we've always got to get that right.
Good information to know, Jennifer. Thanks.